When you think about the ideal location for a green hydrogen project, what comes to mind first? Maybe a desert with extremely strong solar irradiation, or perhaps a coastal region with powerful and consistent winds. Those resources certainly matter. But here is the important point. A location with excellent solar or wind is not automatically a good hydrogen site. Hydrogen production depends on an entire system of resources: infrastructure, customers, land, water, transportation, and economics. In this video, we are going to look at what actually makes a location attractive for green hydrogen production and why the obvious location may not always be the best one. One of the easiest mistakes in hydrogen development is evaluating a site primarily by its renewable resource. Excellent solar helps. Excellent wind helps. But neither one, by itself, guarantees project viability. A hydrogen project is not simply a renewable electricity project with an electrolyzer added to it. The renewable resource has to connect to water, land, infrastructure, transportation, and ultimately demand for the hydrogen being produced. So instead of asking, where is the strongest solar resource, the better question is, where can all the requirements of a hydrogen project work together effectively? That changes how we think about site selection. A good hydrogen location has to solve several problems at the same time. We need electricity. We need water. We need suitable land. We may need grid access. We need an off-taker or some credible destination for the hydrogen. We need a way to transport the product. We need to be able to obtain permits. And eventually, the entire project has to make economic sense. This is why site selection is fundamentally a systems problem. The strongest candidate is usually not the location that dominates one category. It is the location where the important factors work together with the fewest critical weaknesses. The first factor is still extremely important: renewable resource quality. For solar, we want to understand irradiation. For wind, we want to understand wind speed and the quality of the wind regime. But developers also need to think about seasonality, hourly production profiles, and expected annual electricity output. Why? Because resource quality determines how much electricity a given amount of renewable generation capacity can actually deliver. Two locations may have similar installed renewable capacity, but deliver very different quantities of electricity over the course of the year. And because the electrolyzer depends on electricity, that difference can flow directly into hydrogen production. Resource quality is only one side of the electricity question. The other is price. Power is typically one of the largest cost components associated with producing green hydrogen. Look at our simple comparison. Site A has electricity at $25 per megawatt hour. Site B is at $45. Site C is at $70. Even before examining all the other project variables, that difference matters. As the slide emphasizes, as the power price climbs, the hydrogen cost climbs with it. So when screening locations, developers should not simply look for renewable electricity. They need to understand what that electricity is likely to cost the hydrogen project. Now we come to another important question. How often can the electrolyzer actually operate? Imagine the same electrolyzer installed at 3 different sites. At the first site, it operates for around 2,000 hours per year. At another, 4,000 hours. At another, 7,000 hours. The equipment may be similar, but the volume of hydrogen produced can be dramatically different. This creates an important site selection trade-off. Do we choose the location with the absolute cheapest electricity? Or a location where electricity may be available for more operating hours? That is why electricity price and electricity availability have to be considered together. This is where hybrid renewable configurations become interesting. A project may rely on solar only. It may rely on wind only. It may combine solar and wind. Or it may use renewables together with grid assistance. Complementary resources can potentially improve electrolyzer utilization. For example, solar production follows the daylight cycle, while wind may follow a different production pattern. Combining resources can therefore change the electricity profile available to the electrolyzer. The key site selection question becomes less about identifying one perfect renewable resource and more about understanding how the available electricity supply supports the intended operating profile of the hydrogen system. The second major consideration is water. Hydrogen production needs purified feedwater, while the wider facility may also have water requirements associated with treatment, cooling, and auxiliary systems. Potential sources can include groundwater, municipal supplies, surface water, desalination, or recycled water. So a developer should not simply ask whether water exists somewhere near the project. The question is whether an appropriate source is actually available for the proposed facility and whether that supply can support the project over time. Water, therefore, becomes an important screening variable, particularly when comparing locations that may otherwise look very attractive from an energy perspective. There is another important distinction. Having water does not mean that water is immediately ready to enter an electrolyzer. The slide shows a simplified treatment pathway. Raw water enters the system. It goes through filtration. Reverse osmosis may be used. The water is then further purified or deionized before being supplied to the electrolyzer. So the source and quality of the available water matter. A location with abundant water may still require significant treatment infrastructure. That treatment becomes part of the overall project configuration. This is another reason site screening should examine more than the presence or absence of a resource. And water availability alone is not enough. A source can be technically available and still represent a poor long-term choice. We need to think about drought risk. We need to understand competing uses. Agriculture may depend on the same water source. Nearby communities may depend on it. And future climate conditions can affect the reliability of that supply. This is why the slide makes an important distinction. Sustainability matters as much as availability. A hydrogen project is expected to operate for many years. So developers need to look beyond today's water conditions and consider whether the water strategy remains credible over the life of the project. Next comes land. And the important thing to understand is that a hydrogen project requires much more space than the electrolyzer itself. Depending on the project configuration, land may be needed for renewable generation, electrolysis, compression, storage, substations, water systems, roads, and safety zones. That means a developer cannot evaluate land requirements by looking only at the hydrogen production equipment. The entire project footprint has to be considered. A location may appear to have plenty of space for an electrolyzer facility, but become much more constrained once the supporting infrastructure and renewable generation requirements are added. Even large areas of seemingly empty land may not be usable. A site screening process may need to account for terrain. Flood exposure may eliminate some areas. Protected lands can create exclusions. Wetlands can create additional constraints. Urban development, agricultural land, and heritage areas can also affect where infrastructure can realistically be placed. This is why exclusion layers are so important in geographic screening. A very large candidate area can become much smaller once the major constraints are overlaid. So the relevant question is not simply, how much land is there? It is, how much suitable and developable land is actually available? Now let's look at infrastructure, beginning with the grid. Grid access may support backup power. It can help with balancing. It may allow surplus electricity to be exported. It can contribute to reliability. And electricity infrastructure can also matter during construction. But grid access is not automatically cheap or easy. Connection costs may be significant, and connection queues can affect project timelines. So simply identifying a transmission line on a map is not enough. Developers need to understand whether meaningful grid access is actually possible and what that connection could mean for project cost, schedule, and operating strategy. Here is a simple example of why this matters. Site A has excellent solar resource, but it is 150 kilometers away from the infrastructure it needs. Site B is good solar, not quite as strong, but it is only 5 kilometers away. Which one is actually cheaper? The answer cannot be determined from the solar resource alone. The stronger renewable location may require extensive additional infrastructure. Meanwhile, the slightly weaker resource may benefit from proximity to existing systems. This is one of the central lessons of hydrogen site selection. The resource advantage must be weighed against the infrastructure disadvantage. Now we reach one of the most important questions in the entire project. Who will buy the hydrogen? Potential demand may come from ammonia production, refining, steel, chemicals, transportation, power, or export markets. But the fundamental principle is simple. Hydrogen without a customer is not a project. A location could have excellent renewable energy, abundant land, and suitable water. But if there is no credible destination for the hydrogen, the project faces a major problem. That is why proximity to demand, or the ability to economically reach demand, should be considered during site screening rather than being treated as an issue to solve later. This creates another major strategic decision. Should we build the hydrogen facility beside the renewable resource? Or should we build it closer to the customer? In other words, do we move electricity or do we move hydrogen? Every kilometer separating production and demand can introduce additional infrastructure, operating requirements, or logistical complexity. So the optimal answer can vary from one project to another. A remote renewable resource may deliver excellent electricity economics, but create a hydrogen transportation challenge. A location closer to the customer may reduce transportation requirements, but introduce different electricity constraints. Again, site selection becomes a system-level trade-off. Once hydrogen is produced, we still need to move it. Depending on the project, transportation options may include pipelines, tube trailers, liquid hydrogen, or conversion into products such as ammonia, methanol, or other derivatives. Each pathway creates different infrastructure requirements, and those requirements can affect which location makes sense. A site near a pipeline may have an advantage for one project. Another site may work because trucking distances are manageable. A large export project may require conversion infrastructure, so transportation should not be treated as a separate downstream issue. It is part of the site selection decision because it influences whether the location can connect economically to its market. Export-oriented hydrogen projects add another layer of complexity. The project does not end at the electrolyzer. The product may have to move from the production facility into conversion infrastructure, then storage, then a terminal, and eventually onto a ship. That means developers may need to consider port access, deep water capability, storage, terminals, conversion equipment, loading facilities, and shipping routes. So an inland location with outstanding renewable resources may face very different infrastructure challenges from a coastal site. For export projects especially, the entire logistics chain needs to be considered when comparing candidate locations. A site can look excellent technically and still fail because it cannot be permitted or because permitting becomes extremely difficult or slow. Potential considerations include zoning, environmental requirements, water permissions, construction approvals, grid connections, pipelines, and safety requirements. This is why permitting should enter the screening process relatively early. There is limited value in spending significant time optimizing a location that faces fundamental development barriers. A strong resource score does not override regulatory reality. So a good hydrogen location is not only a location where the project can technically operate. It must also be a location where the project can realistically be developed. The surrounding community also matters. Hydrogen projects can affect employment, land use, water, safety perceptions, and the local environment. That means community engagement belongs in site screening. A project may bring economic opportunities, but local stakeholders may also have legitimate questions about how land and resources will be used. Ignoring those concerns does not make them disappear. So local support should be viewed as another project variable that developers need to understand. The earlier these issues are identified, the better the project team can understand whether a proposed location has significant social or development challenges that need to be addressed. Now let's put everything together. Imagine we have 3 candidate locations. Site A is a desert location. It has excellent solar and cheap land. But water is poor, the potential off-taker is far away, and the grid is weak. Site B is an industrial location. Solar is only moderate and land is expensive. But water is good, the off-taker is excellent, and the grid is excellent. Site C is coastal. Wind is excellent. Desalination is available. Port access is excellent. Infrastructure is good, while the off-taker situation is moderate. Which one would you choose? The answer is no longer obvious. Now we score the sites across multiple variables. Site A gets a 10 for renewable resource and a 10 for land. If we looked only at those categories, it might appear to be the clear winner. But its water score is 3. Grid is 4. Offtake is 3. Transport is 4. Site B, meanwhile, has only a 7 for renewable resource, but it performs strongly in water, grid, offtake, and transport. Site C also shows a relatively balanced profile. And this is the reveal. Site A looked best on solar alone, but it may not rank first once the whole system is scored. This is exactly why site selection should be systematic. Start with candidate locations. Run them through a screening process. Score important variables. Compare the candidates. Test your assumptions. Then create a shortlist for deeper analysis. This is also where H2 Hub can help structure preliminary screening. The important distinction is that H2 Hub is not being presented as making the investment decision. Instead, it can help organize early-stage screening and comparison so developers can better understand which locations deserve additional investigation. The objective is not to replace project due diligence. It is to make preliminary project development more structured. And even after a site performs well in screening, the work is not finished. The location still has to survive the economics. The workflow shown here is screen, build, economics. We begin with renewable assumptions, then the electrolyzer, then expected hydrogen production, then CAPEX, then power cost, then LCOH, and then stress testing. This is critical because a location should never be judged independently from the project it will host. A good map location does not automatically produce a good project. The final project configuration and its economics must support the original site selection decision. So here is the main takeaway from this video. The best hydrogen site is not necessarily the place with the most sun. And it is not automatically the location with the most wind either. The strongest site is the location where energy, water, infrastructure, demand, transportation, land, permitting, and economics can work together. That is the difference between looking at a resource and looking at a project. If you are exploring hydrogen project development and want to see how candidate sites can move from preliminary screening into project configuration and economic analysis, explore H2 Hub by Renee Energy at h2hub.reneeenergy.com. And subscribe to Renee Energy for more practical discussions about hydrogen project development, economics, and infrastructure.